Another way of looking at personality is the behaviorist approach. According to the behaviorists, the inner facts of the consciousness are not important. Instead, they believe that our behaviors, and therefore our personalities, are learned primarily through our experiences. The theories of behaviorism arose through experiments, largely on animals, in which behaviors were learned through carefully controlled stimuli. It is the assertion of this article that students who use visual art as a pre-writing stimulus are composing their ideas both in images and in words. The result of the art creation process allows students the distance to elaborate, add details, and create more coherent text. The process of writing is more than putting words on a piece of paper. Effective authors are able to create imagery and to communicate ideas using well-chosen words, phrases, and text structures. Emergent writers struggle with the mechanics of the writing process, i.e., fine motor control for printing legibly, recall of spelling patterns, and the use of syntax and grammar rules. As a result, texts written by young writers tend to be simplistic and formulaic. The artwork facilitates the writing process, resulting in a text that is richer in sensory detail and more intricate than the more traditional writing first crayon drawing second approach. School-to-work transition is a historically persistent topic of educational policy making and reform that impacts national systems of vocational education and training. Bailey, 1995. The transition process refers to a period between completion of general education and the beginning of vocational education, or the beginning of gainful employment, as well as to training systems, institutions, and programs that prepare young people for careers. Ronner, 1999. The status passage of youth from school to work has changed structurally under late modernism, and young people are forced to adapt to changing demands of their environment, especially when planning for entry into the labor market. Since the transition to a job is seen as a major success in life, youth who manage this step successfully are more optimistic about their future. Still others are disillusioned and pushed to the margins of society. While some young people have developed successful strategies to cope with these requirements, those undereducated and otherwise disadvantaged in society often face serious problems when trying to prepare for careers. Longer transitions lead to a greater vulnerability and to risky behaviors. The models were estimated using historical time series data from 1973 to 1998. The data were obtained from several sources, such as the World Tourism Organization, Australian Bureau of Statistics, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund. The results suggest that the estimated elasticity parameters are consistent with standard economic theory. The number of short-term resident departures is positively influenced by per capita real household disposable income, and the price of domestic travel and accommodation are negatively influenced by the price of travel and accommodation overseas. The estimated demand models were used to develop the Tourism Forecasting Council's long-run forecasts. The forecasts suggest that the number of short-term resident departures will increase strongly over the next 10 years, largely due to the strength of the Australian economy, competitive travel prices, and Australians' interest in experiencing different cultures and lifestyles. Over the past 10 years, Australian overseas departures have grown from 1.7 million to 3.2 million. This represents strong average annual growth of 6.5%. This paper analyses outbound travel demand to each destination country using the travel demand models of short-term resident departures. The models are specified in terms of a double logarithmic linear functional form, with overseas departures as the dependent, variable and real household, disposable income prices of travel and accommodation in Australia and overseas and the exchange rate as independent variables. The automatic corollary of that principle is that each country must be free to determine its own development strategy. It is essential that all donors and lenders accept the principle of country ownership of national development strategies. This implies the acceptance of the principle that development strategies should not only be attuned to country circumstances, but also be prepared and implemented under the leadership of the governments of the countries themselves. The 2005 World Summit also acknowledged, in this regard, that all countries must recognize the need for developing countries to strike a balance between their national policy priorities and their international commitments. The principal and most consistently articulated recommendation of the World Conferences was that countries must take full responsibility for their own development. National responsibility for national development is the necessary consequence of sovereignty. The Monterrey Consensus states that each country has primary responsibility for its own economic and social development, and the role of national policies and development strategies cannot be overemphasized. National development strategies and policies are therefore critically important. This was reflected most recently at the 2005 summit, when member states agreed on a target date of 2006 for all developing countries to adopt and start implementation of these strategies to achieve the internationally agreed development goals and objectives, including the MDGs. Economic dimension of globalization involves the international financial institutions, i.e. the IMF and WB. Stabilization and adjustment are sponsored by the two respectively and are rooted in the ideology of free market. At the other end of the spectrum, protesters see globalization in a very different light than the Treasury Secretary of the United States, or the finance or trade ministers of most of the advanced industrial countries. The difference in views is so great that one wonders, are the protesters and the policymakers talking about the same phenomenon? Are they looking at the same data? Are the visions of those in power so clouded by special and particular interests?